welcome to this week's episode of Compliance Deconstructed. You have your wonderful hosts once again, Jessica Zeff, Lorie Davis, and Elvan Baker. And just to stress the point, you guys, we have these handy dandy new mugs, all three of us. They say simply compliance. Oh, see, Elvan's got the idea. I've got too much light on mine. There we
Dun, ta,
go.
dun, ta,
So we
ta.
are, if we weren't professional before, it's these mugs that are making us feel professional today. All righty. So
And
now
this
my
is where I
ladies think
say
I'm
it with a
nuts.
very low voice. And for all your compliance needs, call 1-800. I just don't have the number in front of me. Sorry.
All right. See, guys, sorry. We've been warmed up this morning, so we are ready to go. And the topic we want to talk about and share with you today really has to do around the importance of budgeting and resourcing your compliance program appropriately. And we want to work through why that is so important. We've had so many conversations with people, and from our own experiences, we've seen that compliance can sometimes be shunted to the side as something that you could do at the side of your desk, or that there's a real misunderstanding around what compliance involves and how much work that really is and how many different skills it requires in order to do this thing that we call compliance. And if it's not resourced appropriately, if you don't think through the budget in advance, you're going to run into problems actually
Mhm.
implementing your compliance program effectively. And to kick off our conversation, because Elvan has already gotten into budgeting early this year, she's ahead of me and Lorie. So she's got some feedback and she's got some observations to make and she'd like to get them off her chest. But to
Of course.
kickstart the conversation, Elvan,
Abs-
over to you.
All right. Well, I think we operate in a healthcare that is a business in our country, and there is the conversation is not about if something is right or wrong, but that is the basis of our conversation because it's a healthcare. We operate in a system where healthcare is a business model. We look at productivity, meaning each time we have a person working, we want them to produce a certain amount of revenue for us, i.e., clinicians. Every time we employ something, we want a return on our investment. And because we operate in that system where we see individuals, and this really would not be any different if I'm running a car mechanic shop, I want mechanics who can produce the X amount, right? Within that hour. So it's the same mentality. Because we operate within that system, anything that falls, any ancillary support services that fall outside of that individual who is directly making the money, creating revenue in the field, becomes a subject of budgetary constraints. It
Mhm.
just does, because if a clinician is not there to see a patient, then in that minute, you are not producing the revenue that's going to sustain your business. However, if you, there is this just general common idea that if you have two people working the accounting department, ancillary support service to your healthcare business, and one accountant number one is sick for X amount of days, that is not going to change possibly the trajectory. The feeling is that it's not going to change the trajectory of what you make. And if you can stretch accountant number two for a while, you can still get the job done. And
It's
a
not
lot of
revenue
accountants,
generating, right?
no, it's not a
It
revenue
doesn't generate
generator.
revenue. Yeah.
And the idea is, okay, how much can I then stretch number two if that number one never comes back? Or, hey, did I really need two anyways? So can I get the job done with just one and cut my cost? So this is a basis of our conversation here, I believe, because of the template, again, that we operate in as a healthcare as a business model that we have to operate in. And there's necessarily nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it is. Currently, I found myself at the crossroads of operations and compliance many, many times. Therefore, the responsibility has fallen on me to figure out how to allocate resources that are available to accomplish what needs to be accomplished within within the compliance program. Why is this a challenge? Because again, there's always the pushback from the business owners at whatever level to try to get the job done with the least amount of expenses, expense being obviously labor is our biggest expense. So, trying to figure out how one can do with less. And it comes again from a misunderstanding of what it takes to complete compliance tasks. It's really hard to put it down to this task takes 2 hours versus that task takes 4 hours versus the other task that's going to take 6 months and 4 hours a month. And so there's that misunderstanding that's a part of the challenge where you get the pushback between, if especially for those who has served as a compliance officer and who are responsible for creating these allocation of resources, that can be really hard. Because one thing you need to understand is that there are pillars of a good compliance program that you need to accomplish, and you may be able to drill down and assign certain amount of human labor hours to each of those pillars. But because you are delivering the compliance program to humans by humans, it's really hard to predict the variability within those
Yes.
allocation of resources. Therefore, it may take me 8 hours, just throwing numbers out there. It may take Elvan 8 hours to create the compliance program and another 8 hours to actually execute it, while it may take Jessica, who is certified in healthcare compliance, 4 hours to create the program, but maybe 120 hours to execute it. Again, because we have different skills, different ways of nagging humans.
No,
Again,
but wait. Can I can I add to that though, Alvan?
you should
Because
add
you're
to that. You should
making
make me
some
stop
really
talking. I'm getting to be a
no,
runaway train.
no, you're making some really good points, and I'd like to unpick it. Part of part of the challenge though is also about number 1, it's the nature of compliance work. You don't
Mhm,
do it yourself,
mhm,
right? Unlike other teams that get to focus on what they're doing, right? They
mhm,
have a much more
mhm,
narrower scope. In the world of compliance, you're dealing with whole organizations and other
mhm,
stakeholders.
mhm,
So, and there is that level of unpredictability when you're the party responsible for doing investigations or handling audits or complaints, and you don't know what's going to be coming in on any one particular day. That's part of what we love around compliance, right? Not every day is the same, but it brings certain challenges when you're trying to identify what resources are appropriate and what your budget should look like. You're working with you don't know, there's a level of unpredictability, number 1. Number 2, you're working with an entire organization, so you've got interdependencies that you can't always control,
mhm,
right? And that makes it very challenging as well. When you have a compliance budget, it's not just the budget for your particular team. You're talking about a budget that has to cover certain obligations like training, risk management, audit that actually requires input from teams around the organization. So that's a lot more effort and a lot more work.
mhm,
Also with compliance, how to put this? It's hard to it's not a it's not a cookie cutter exercise. It requires everything that comes in front of you requires a level of planning, of thought, probably research into rules, regulations, requirements. and what actually defines compliance. And it requires a plan. So this isn't something that you can necessarily say it's going to take 1 hour, it's going to take half an hour. This is how it should happen. It doesn't work that way. So, for example, let's say it's very simple, isn't it, to write a policy and procedure? All you do is write it, right? I've had people say that, just write it. Oh, really? No, that's not the reality of it. So I will say, look, I will start the ball rolling. I will draft a policy and procedure. Maybe that takes me half an hour.
Mhm.
Maybe. Let's just be conservative here. But actually, I haven't written your policy and procedure. I now, as a compliance professional, need to take this draft. I've hopefully already had a conversation with you about how your part of the organization works. Here's a draft. We're going to have a conversation about it. Does it really reflect how you operate and your reporting structures? So, could you please, other party, give me some feedback? Oh, okay, you've given me feedback. I need to go through it. I need to incorporate that feedback into the revised policy. Hey, by the way, business owner, are you good with the final draft? You are? Okay. Well, now we need to make sure there's staff
Mhm.
training.
Mhm.
We need to make sure that we put this in our policy book. We need to set up a process for making sure this is reviewed in line with our policy and policies. So, what feels like a very simple, hey, can you draft a policy and procedure? Okay, but it's really not that simple. And that's just a very basic example. If you're talking about investigations and you think about, well, it's not just going and interviewing people, that's not what's going on there. There's a whole lot more activity that's happening, just like in any other job that anyone has. It's very easy to make assumptions about, oh, that should be easy to do. That should be easy to do. And actually, it's not. And there are very specific reasons for that: the unpredictability, the scope of the work, and the fact that it's the role is very heavily thought driven. That's not even the right language. But it's not like a machine or a factory. It's not something you can reproduce very quickly. Every situation requires planning and input,
And you need
some
to
a
be
little bit
flexible to
less, some a
change
little bit
that.
more.
Yeah. And you need to be
Exactly.
flexible to dial it up, dial it down, change the settings at each task with the unknown that's going to come your way. That's why you need to be able to plan in a way that gives room to that flexibility.
Mhm.
And I'm in a second, I'm going to shut up and let Lori talk, but I have seen firsthand where you have, again, going back to that same thought of the accountant, can I make it work with one? I have been in situations where the due to budgetary constraints, you lose team members, the workload is not going anywhere, then you divide and conquer with whomever is left within the department, but then things invariably then take longer. So then now you overstretched an already pressured situation and created a possibly an environment where one of my old compliance officers would call decision burnout, because whomever is left behind who's taken on more work, it's not even about, oh, you're working 40 hours, work 45, 50. It's not even about that. There's only so much mental space one can give before they burn out of the subject, about the subject, regarding this, it does. Then you're looking at possibly human errors going up.
So this all ties in. I mean, like any other part of the business, right? These are challenges that
Mhm.
compliance isn't exempt from. I think there's some sort of, because compliance, I don't know, it's there's so many misperceptions. I think there's an idea that compliance, is exempt from all of these other challenges that other areas of the business may see, including burnout, including overload, including missed opportunities, missed risks. But that's just not true. Their compliance can be like any other department, although it has its own challenges, right? So we're coming back to this idea of how important it is to make sure you understand, you have an idea of what compliance really entails within an organization, and being able to clearly articulate that to whoever is holding the purse strings. And I'd say, there are kind of ways of thinking through what resources you're going to need and making that argument. And while we were prepping yesterday, Lorie made some excellent observations that I hadn't really thought quite in this way about how you can start to frame up your budget. But before we go there, and I do want to hear from Lorie, and listeners, so do you, because she has some great ideas. I do want to mention, because I'm boring and horrible, that actually, again, this is one of those topics that we haven't just pulled out of our
Mhm.
pulled out of our heads and decided to beat you with. So, in case you find it useful, you should know that our wonderful Office of the Inspector General, in their compliance guidance and their resource manual, they actually call out resourcing and budgeting for compliance. And if we look at, once again, I don't do this very often, but once again, I come with the visual aids. I don't know how well you can see this, but we're looking at the general compliance program guidance. Hey, for those of you who are not looking, Elvan has a wonderful pair of binoculars, and you really do need to see this. She's
This is
looking
how
at our
somebody needs to be
compliance
doing it.
guidance. You know
Yeah.
you love it. All right. But
And I
on
believe
our
these are super OG,
wonderful
by the way. It's not like, you know, this is how
see,
old we all are.
get out of here. Yeah, but you're using a word like OG. Right. All right. But in the guidance, what it says is the board should ensure that the compliance officer has, let's wait for it, da, 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 sufficient power, independence, and resources to implement, maintain, and monitor the entity's compliance program and advise the board about the entity's compliance operations, and risk. And again, if you didn't listen to our other episodes, the
Mhm.
OIG has another document called Measuring Compliance Program Effectiveness, a resource guide. And you can get this on the OIG's website, by the way. But in that resource guide, they also talk about compliance budgeting and resources, and they look at metrics to understand whether a compliance function is actually resourced appropriately. All right. So, just to give you the context, we've given you the context of the conversation. And obviously, we're talking about this because we've been in the position of running a very lean compliance program, probably a bit leaner than we would have liked and felt
Mhm.
comfortable with. And we also work with a lot of organizations and our compliance colleagues who find themselves juggling this same situation, trying to run robust compliance program on increasingly fewer and fewer resources. So it's a very real issue. I'm sure most listeners will have some empathy for the issues that we're raising. But as I was saying before, I decided to make a plug for the OIG guidance. Lorie, Elvin, and I were talking, as we often do. We prep for these episodes, and that's sometimes where we get some of our best ideas. And we were talking about, well, how do you start? What's a good place as you're framing up your budget? We're heading for the autumn. A lot of organizations start their budgeting right around now. And Lorie, you said something really profound might be the wrong word, but it's a wonderful idea about linking up your compliance work plan and your risk assessment and your audit plan. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I just think I like to think in some project manager terms. So he's thinking about a roadmap. And very often, when you're thinking about budgeting, your roadmap is your compliance plan and your audit plan. So putting those together with the addition of obviously the risk assessment that comes first. But kind of those three things together really make for an effective budget, because once you know, hey, in general, I think I'm going to have this happening in the next 12 months under the seven elements, then I can start to think, okay, this is how many resources I have in house. This is how many hours I think that's going to take. And again, this is all to a certain extent might be some horseshoes and hand grenades in terms of proximity, but it really starts to give you a good plan. And then from there, if you don't have the resources in house, then you need to think about, hey, do I need to get a consultant? Do I need to get some external support? But, thinking through those things, I think right now in the regulatory landscape of where we are with the current administration and the Congress at the federal level, coupled with many of the roadblocks we're seeing at the state level, really should make compliance professionals give pause and consider maybe budgeting some extra hours for things that they weren't planning they were going to have to do. If I think about the final rule and the one big beautiful bill and all those things that are going to come into play, roughly 15 months from now or sooner, I need to start budgeting for that and think about how am I going to include all of that, and that should be reflective of your compliance plan. And then when I go to the board or my leadership committee or what a compliance committee, I need to have that all in my back pocket to talk about with them.
So your budget isn't a kind of 20-minute exercise. And what
No.
might be helpful is, if you have it, look at your data from the year before.
Yeah.
What were the surprises the year before? What did you spend your money on the year before? And start that as your, okay, all right, here's a little bit of a foundation. Now, looking forward into the next year. And remember, your budget may or may not be approved the
It
way that
never
you set
is.
it out, right? No, it never is. So also, I'm probably not supposed to say this, add a little bit. Assume that you're going to be
Yeah.
spending a little
Yes.
bit more, and you
But
probably will.
and also think about writing your budget not as permission, but as forgiveness. This is what I need to have a healthy and robust compliance committee.
Mhm.
And yes, you compare down, but I know some people who create multiple scenarios. This is my best case, this is my medium case, and I'm running out of hands. So here's my worst case. And they kind of scale it so that they've got options when they face their leadership or they face the board or compliance committee to talk through things. But in reality, your budget should be a reflection. But I just think the regulatory and audit landscape, I mean, if you had done your budget a year and you had planned for all RADV audits to suddenly be done annually, I don't think you would have budgeted appropriately, right? Nobody thought about that happening. Nobody expected that. Not saying right, wrong, or indifferent, just saying you didn't plan for that more than likely. So I think it's those kind of contingencies that you have to have built in, and also be prepared to talk about, hey, totally understand you, but if we don't do all of this, here's the risk of what could happen. And Jess, I know we talked about risk yesterday, but make sure they have their eyes open to, hey, we're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Just want to make sure that you're comfortable with that. Something has to give because you only have so many people, so many hours, and so much you can accomplish. And just being realistic and transparent.
And we've talked a lot about that in our episodes, that need for communication. And really, I love the idea that you just gave, Lori, around those three scenarios: best case, worst case, and something in the middle, right? That's a wonderful approach. Plan your budget based maybe on what you saw happening last year. You need to think about what information you know about what's coming down the pike and that you need to plan for. and have that conversation, and in the context of risk management. But it's that communication. My point is, it's that communication and that discussion, and making sure that whoever's holding the money or the budget really
Yeah.
understands what they're resourcing and what they're not resourcing, and that you document this as a risk.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Make
And
sure that that is documented.
yeah, and sometimes it comes down to compromise
Mm.
because the leadership may have things that they want to see compliance achieve or accomplish, and it wasn't on your radar until you go have that discussion, and you'd be like, yep, no problem, we can do this, but talk to me about what your priorities are in terms of what can come off, what can we do less of. Again, keep it in the framework of the seven elements, what's legislatively, contractually, regulatory required, so that you're not running afoul of what's on the books, so to speak, in terms of contract or law. But at the same time, you've got a finite amount of money and people.
So, a lot of folks listening in, including the three of us, although we're talking, we're not listening, we have experience of setting budgets, right? I'd like to talk about some of the surprises over the years that we've learned to incorporate into our budget. So I know one of my biggest surprises in the past was in managing privacy and security breaches. There came a time when I needed what's called a forensics vendor. I won't go into that, but it's an area of expertise to recover data, right? And I needed a vendor that could work forensically to recover data. I didn't have money in my budget for that, and it's pretty expensive. And I learned from then on that if you're managing a privacy and security program, not only do you need to have the budget for your cybersecurity budget has got to include money to cover external forensics expertise. If you don't have it internally, and most of us don't, then you've got a budget,
Yeah.
right? And have that money available. So that was one of my personal biggest surprises. How about you ladies? What's taken you by surprise that you've had to learn from in terms of budgeting?
I think along the
Lori,
same lines for me, there was an investigation, and what had to be looked through, unless we gotten an external help, it would have taken us so much time that could it have been done? Yes, it would have taken us a lot longer because that was not our expertise to get to the finish line. That then we would have to pull a lot of us from other tasks that also needed to get done. So then, just like Lori said, what are you winning? What are you losing? Then we're like, okay, we need the external help to get this one project done so that we can continue to focus on our normal duties, and that person can do that, and it came out of the areas that unfortunately seems to go first, but it came from somebody's certification program and another person continuing education hours, because we chose, but that was a group choice, by the way, that we chose to invest it into another person who had the expertise, who got the job done, instead of us mulling over the same. And this was a fraud case. It's just mulling over the data that would have taken us hours and hours and hours and put everything else on hold.
okay. So a few hints and tips that Elvan and I were, working, Elvan, Lori, and I were working through yesterday. When you're considering the budget, think about allocating money for internal and external audits. That's I think, Lori, that's one of your biggest concerns around budget,
Yeah.
making sure you've got enough money in your budget for that.
Yeah, and understanding what is in your budget. What is compliance responsible for budgeting for when it comes to audits, technology, policy, procedure, time, system upgrades, all of that. Does that fall under somebody else's bucket? I think that one. And the other one for me is external counsel. I think it's figuring out, and again, everybody's organization is going to work a little different, whether legal falls under your purview or another team's. But I think it's thinking about if you need to engage external counsel, where's the budget for that? Who owns that? So those for me are the big things I'm thinking about, along with the general resourcing and things like that in a budget.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. So to sum up, we're thinking about making sure there's funding for regulatory external scrutiny, internal or external audit or investigations. We never think we're going to be audited or investigated, and yet there you go. There you have it. So making sure there's money for that, making sure there's money for external legal counsel. I've been burned a lot around privacy or security investigations and or breaches and having to follow OCR, Office for Civil Rights, reporting guidelines and notifications, and also state notification requirements. And like I said, forensic support. Those are big areas I had to learn in my career to make sure there was money allocated for those. And I learned because there came a time when I needed those services and I needed those resources, and it wasn't available to me. And it was quite a bit of rough going. And going back to, so certainly think about also, are you an organization that's heavily regulated? Do you have accreditations and
Yeah.
licensing? Like it's not just
That's
these
another good one.
regulatory
Yeah.
requirements. Think a little bit more broadly about compliance, because even if you're licensed or you're accredited, well, what does all of that mean? What resources do you need to pull that off? And it's
Yeah.
not just financial, but it's expertise. What are the resources you're going to need? Where are you going to get those? And what is it going to cost? And that's got to feed into your budget.
Mhm.
And as Lori said, and that was a big, we were interested in this idea of, compliance budgets, they actually can sit across an organization. So, what dollars are being used across the organization for compliance activities? And are those dollars being used for those activities? Or are you then in your own compliance budget having to scrounge around and ask for those dollars once again? So there's really a lot to think about as your budget setting. And the concept is hopefully you're never going to get I don't think. I don't want to say never, but it's really hard to get 100%. It's hard to have your compliance program, I think, 100% always perfectly well resourced. Why is that? Part of it's the nature of the job. Like we talked about early on in this podcast, you really never know what's around the corner and what you're going to have to deal with. But also, sometimes expertise can be difficult to source. Remember that budgeting and resources aren't just about the money, it's about that expertise and being able to bring it in. Even if you need another pair of hands, can you find the expertise, the compliance expert or the risk management, or, it could be privacy or security or whatever, someone to write policies and procedures or help you summarize a proposed or final rule. It's not like these experts grow on trees. So there's always that challenge, and finding them in a timely way.
Yeah.
Like, even if you do find them, can you get a contract up and running? Like, if you work in the health IT sector, things are moving so quickly that if it takes you 2 or 3 weeks to find the expertise that you need, you might already no longer need that particular resource, or
Mhm.
Yeah.
it might have the delay in identifying that resource and getting them on board may have had a significant impact on your organization's ability to move forward,
Mhm.
right? So there are those particular challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else to add? We've tried to acknowledge what's going on. We've tried to offer some hints and tips. Anything
Yeah.
else, ladies?
I would say also think about any audit prep you might need. I do know that there are organizations that help with RADV audits if that's not in your wheelhouse, or program audits, or ECROs, or ISCAs, or APTCs, or one third financials. I know I'm using a lot of acronyms, but those external audits, if that's not in your organization's wheelhouse, or you've got a small organization, think about those consulting fees. I know that goes with staffing, but it is something to think about. And I do know organizations that do that. They outsource their external audit prep and execution.
And another part of this, I was just thinking about when you said there's always, we are in an era of automation. So a part of it also for our compliance professionals who are responsible for not only creating budgets but also utilization of resources is to understand what's out there that makes your job also easier. It doesn't mean depend on external sources for everything, but there are sources also out there that you can utilize and personalize and make it work for your organization. So there is also that out there. There are companies that sell editable policy and procedure for XYZ sector or niche of the industry. All you have to do is then build that into your budget. If you've gotten great feedback that a lot of different companies are using it, and you have done the vetting that it truly meets all the regulatory needs, then is it a better, instead of reinventing the wheel, is it a better use of your time and resources to purchase that and edit it to fit your organization? There's that too. So not everything is doom and gloom. There is help out there to make things a little bit better, faster, because no, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. At one point, I had the luxury of comparing the compliance program handbook of two different home health companies. And let me tell you, neither were purchased from an outside source. They were super close to each other because certain things, there's only one way to skin the cat. It was almost identical. And I'm like, I felt bad for two individuals back in the day who had to recreate the wheel for themselves when that could have been automated, because there are certain regulatory things you need to hit right within your handbook. So wouldn't those individuals love to take the time, which is a resource, and use it for to better the organization rather than out there writing policy and procedure for something that's like, that I don't know. There's only so many ways
I'm
that you
more in
can
favor.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm more in favor of the old-fashioned route on policies and procedures. I'm just going to say that I'm more in favor of designing policies and procedures. I know that there's a core of a lot of them that
Yes.
are very similar, but I take the route of designing policies and procedures that fit the needs of the organization,
Correct. But
and that
when
people
you're
will
writing about,
follow.
yes, correct. But I will do the pushback on this one. When you are writing a policy about fraud, if you don't want to see fraud in your organization, there's only so many ways of writing that. Like,
No, I know,
you know,
but the procedure might be slightly different for
different. Yes, and
reporting
that's,
might
I
be
think
different.
that's
But
where
that
it
I get
comes
you.
in, where you get, I've seen this at work, and it really does work. Like, you get these documents that are editable, and it does point out to the parts of what you need to edit. You don't need to search the document. Those are like highlighted, you know, who's going to respond, what's going to happen, what are the consequences, what is the hierarchical steps. So all I'm trying to say is that it's not all doom and gloom where you're going to create something from scratch and you have to squeeze in every, turn a penny into a dollar at every corner.
Hey, hold up. Do you know what I do for a living? I'm a consultant, madam. No, I'm teasing. But I take your point. There are ways of, as you're setting your budgeting, there are ways of conserving and making the best use of resources. And I tend to think of resources also as expertise. Like, that's really important to me because it's very hard to find
And to
compliance
your point,
experts in the field.
correct. Do we
So
want somebody to write down the policy that they've never written, spending 80 bare minimum doing the research, or do we want them to come to Jessica, who's going to get it done in 8 hours for them?
no, my point is a little bit different, but my point is saying one thing we forgot to talk about in the budget is making sure you budget for development opportunities and growth because as compliance professionals, your skills are only as good as how sharp you keep them, right? And the compliance space is always changing, right? The regulatory space is always changing. And at the moment, there's so much change. So making sure you allocate funding for that kind of development. But with that development does come network and access to thought leadership about how compliance can be run more effectively, more efficiently. And going back to exactly your point, as you're building your network and connecting through these development opportunities, what resources are out there that can be leveraged and don't have to be built? So, thinking about when you set aside finances and time for individuals to get their training. It's not just the technical compliance training that they're getting, but it's all the networking and the connections and the access to other resources that you're paying for as well in that budget. And there's a payoff from that, from experience. The things that I've gotten and the information and the tools and the resources that have been shared at conferences and through colleagues and networking from other compliance professionals have helped me to do my job better, more efficiently throughout my entire career. So that's an important aspect to I think, make sure that there's funding in the budget and also understanding that that funding, although let's pretend it might be, I don't know, $1,500 all in for one person to attend a conference, there's so much more than the $1,500. Your return on that investment is going to be so much more. And so it makes it worthwhile, in my humble opinion, to make sure that there's some sort of allocation and view to staff development and compliance for your compliance professionals. That's where I was going to go. I was just building off what you said, Alvan, because
Mhm.
there's no reason why we shouldn't be supporting each other. I mean, I know that that's not quite true, right? We live in a very competitive world, but amongst compliance professionals where we try and protect our organizations and support one another to do that job effectively, there are very good reasons why we help each other. And if we have a good idea or a really great tool that someone's developed, we often share it with each other to help each other. And that can also help out in terms of thinking about your budget and where your resources are coming
Correct.
from.
And you
Okay,
remember,
so
we talked about this in one of our episodes. It's like reach out to us, listeners. Reach out to your colleagues on LinkedIn. Again, nobody's sharing trade secrets here. Certain things, you ask 4 people, 3 of them are giving you same or alike answer. Move on. You got it.
well, and there's always that discussion. We're always talking about push and pull, always. And that comes into the discussions. Even when Lorie, Elvan, and I have a discussion, it's a discussion. What are the pros and the cons? What are the risks and the benefits? So you're not making these decisions or having conversations in complete isolation. You're really having a discussion about the ups and the downs. There are only so many ways of saying this, but it's really thinking through what are your organizational goals, what are your needs, what are your
Mhm.
resources, both in terms of people, expertise, and money, right? So there's always that kind of balance. So happy to talk it through. As Elvan said, we're always interested in talking through. That's kind of why this role is so amazing. There are so many opportunities to figure out the right strategy or the right approach, and it depends on specific circumstances pretty much to each question. So if you have some thoughts, anything you want us to include in a podcast episode or not, absolutely okay. But feel free to share with us your thoughts on the episode and any thoughts about what you might be seeing in the compliance space. So with that, I think we will love you and leave you. Thank you all for listening, making the time to listen to us gab about budgeting and resources. It's not every day you get to say that. And remember the OIG's General Compliance Program Guidance and Elvan's rather spectacular binoculars. You see? All right. We'll see you guys next
Plug for the
time.
mug.
Take care of yourselves.
Take care,
And a
everyone.
plug for the mug.
Thank you for listening.
Take care.
I love these ladies.
Great.
Bye
Take care.
now. Take care.